What if a single mispronunciation in an elegant restaurant could transform ridicule into respect, humiliation into triumph? When Amara set down the wine list before the sneering billionaire who mocked her accent with cruel laughter, she never imagined this moment would unlock doors to 7 continents. The Harvard linguistics graduate carried plates with calloused hands while speaking fluently in languages her tormentor couldn't identify. But tonight the power would shift, leaving everyone in shocked silence as worlds collided across white linen tablecloths. The chandelier light splintered across the gold-trimmed china as Amara slipped through the staff entrance of La Maison Dorée, her fingers still cramped from transcribing lecture notes on advanced linguistic theory all afternoon. Her second master's degree was consuming what little time remained between double shifts at the restaurant and visits to her grandmother, whose medical bills arrived with red stamps in increasingly alarming frequency. She straightened her pressed black uniform, tucking away thoughts of the United Nations application she had completed for the 3rd time last night, a dream that seemed to recede further with each passing month, despite her fluency in 7 languages and her Harvard linguistics degree. The familiar scent of butter and reduction sauces filled the air as she navigated past line cooks, shouting orders in a chaotic blend of English, French, and Spanish that her brain automatically sorted and translated. Amara caught her reflection in the polished silver serving trays. Adjusting the small golden pin bearing her name, the only personal touch allowed in this temple of culinary exclusivity, where entrees cost more than she earned in a day. When she entered the main dining room, Marcel, the head waiter, beckoned her with a sharp flick of his wrist, his expression already communicating disapproval before words followed. His eyes performed the usual inventory of her appearance, lingering a beat too long on her hair that she had carefully styled to be both professional and protective of her natural texture. The reservation book lay open before him, a specific table circled in red ink. She listened as Marcel explained that the chairman of Orion Technologies would be dining with his executive team and a special guest, his tone suggesting both the importance of the assignment and his hesitation in giving it to her. His eyes narrowed slightly as he said, "If only Philippe were here instead. But you will have to do. Just try to be less, how shall we say, noticeable when you speak." The familiar sting of the suggestion settled into the space between her shoulder blades, joining countless similar comments, catalogued over years of service industry work. She had learned to respond with a practiced smile that revealed nothing of the Harvard valedictorian speech she had delivered to a standing ovation, nothing of the 6 research papers she had published, nothing of the translation work she freelanced for diplomatic missions when they were shorthanded. Amara simply nodded and accepted the table assignment, calculating the potential tip against her grandmother's prescription costs, while memorizing the evening's specials in all their elaborate detail. She watched as Marcel distributed other sections to newer servers with less experience, catching the subtle exchanges between her colleagues that communicated their relief at avoiding the notorious Maxwell Stone and his demanding entourage. Amara rolled her shoulders back and took a steadying breath, reminding herself that every interaction was temporary, every slight a stepping stone towards something greater, every difficult table an opportunity to practice the diplomatic poise she would need when finally standing in the halls of the United Nations, if that day ever came. Friends, before we go further, may I ask a small favor? Please subscribe to our channel. It truly helps us keep bringing you these stories, and reaching 1,000 subscribers soon is so important for us to continue. We also love hearing from you. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how our little storytelling circle is spreading across the world. And if you enjoyed the beginning, give this video a like, and let's share thoughts on the whole story together below. The mahogany doors of La Maison Dorée swung open precisely at 8 o'clock, admitting a gust of autumn air and the unmistakable presence of power as Maxwell Stone strode in, flanked by 4 executives whose tailored suits cost more than Amara's annual tuition. The restaurant's Ambient murmur quieted momentarily, other diners turning subtly to observe the tech billionaire whose ruthless business tactics had graced the cover of Fortune magazine 3 times this year alone. Maxwell's voice carried deliberately across the room, a carefully cultivated baritone discussing market capitalization figures that exceeded the gross domestic product of several nations. Amara approached with practiced composure, water pitcher in hand, as the men settled into their seats without acknowledging her presence. She caught fragments of their conversation about the Westbrook manufacturing facility and its imminent closure, the words 2,000 workers and operational redundancy slicing through the expensive air like careless knives. Maxwell spread his hands across the pristine tablecloth, gold cufflinks catching the light as he laughed about union representatives begging for a 6-month extension. Amara poured water with steady hands, despite the knowledge that her cousin's husband worked at that very factory, his 3 children and mortgage depending on the paycheck. These men dismissed between sips of sparkling water she served. She distributed menus with quiet efficiency, her professional smile never wavering when one executive gestured for service without looking up, snapping his fingers as if summoning a pet. The sommelier approached with obvious deference, bowing slightly toward Maxwell while describing wine pairings until Amara noticed a latecomer being escorted to their table. Unlike the others, this gentleman moved with unhurried grace, his silver hair and warm brown skin contrasting with thoughtful eyes that met hers directly as she pulled out his chair. He thanked her, in a low voice that carried no expectation of audience, a simple human acknowledgement that stood out amid the theatrical performance of importance unfolding around him. While Maxwell held court with anecdotes about his latest acquisition, the older gentleman observed more than spoke, his simple gold wedding band and modest watch suggesting different priorities than his tablemates. Amara described the evening's specials with precise diction, maintaining eye contact with each patron despite how Maxwell's attention drifted repeatedly to his phone during her recitation. When she mentioned the duck confit with blackberry reduction, one executive interrupted to ask if anything on the menu was actually edible, triggering raucous laughter from his colleagues while the older gentleman frowned slightly. Amara absorbed the dismissal with the same dignity she had maintained through 4 years of similar treatment, responding that the chef had received 3 Michelin stars and would be delighted to prepare something to their exact specifications. She recorded their orders with meticulous attention, noting the older gentleman's request for the simplest item on the menu delivered with a gentle smile that acknowledged her as a fellow human rather than a service function. As she departed for the kitchen, Amara straightened her spine against the weight of their indifference, each step measured and deliberate, her worth undiminished by their inability to perceive it. The crimson wine caught the candlelight as Amara returned to the table, balancing the tray of appetizers with practiced precision while carefully pronouncing the French delicacies with their proper intonation. She had just begun describing the foie gras torchon with fig compote when Maxwell Stone tilted his head, his eyes narrowing with predatory amusement as she reached a particularly melodic phrase in her description. For this evening we have a special preparation with Madagascar vanilla and Sichuan peppercorn, she explained, her native Sierra Leonean accent blending harmoniously with the French terminology she had mastered during 4 semesters of culinary linguistics. Maxwell suddenly straightened in his chair, lips curling into a smirk that immediately silenced his colleagues. The foie gras is served with the fige compote and Madagascar vanilla, he mimicked, exaggerating her accent to grotesque proportions, his voice rising to a falsetto that bore no resemblance to her measured tones. Perhaps Madame can tell us if people eat fige compote in the jungle too, he continued, each syllable dripping with mockery as his companions erupted in expensive laughter that ricocheted off crystal and china. The humiliation bloomed hot under Amara's collar, a familiar sensation that had accompanied her from elementary school classrooms to university lecture halls, to the polished floors of job interviews where her credentials vanished beneath the sound of her voice. She felt her fingernails press into her palm beneath the serving tray, the small crescents of pain grounding her as the laughter continued. $14,000 remained on her grandmother's medical bills, $800 on this month's rent, $320 for next semester's textbooks, and 100% certainty that responding as these men deserved would cost her this job immediately. The quiet older gentleman watched the scene unfold without joining the laughter, his eyes moving between Maxwell and Amara with an expression that shifted from surprise to disappointment to something harder to identify. His fingers tapped once against the tablecloth as Maxwell launched into another mocking imitation, this one incorporating exaggerated gestures that made his wedding ring flash under the chandelier light. Amara maintained her professional posture through sheer force of will, the countless similar moments throughout her life having built a callus over her pride that allowed her to stand straight while bleeding dignity. "Would you care to hear about our seafood selection this evening?" she continued after the laughter subsided, her voice betraying nothing of the Harvard debate champion who had once reduced opponents to stammering confusion, nothing of the woman who had translated peace accords between warring factions during her internship, nothing of the rage that burned beneath her carefully neutral expression. The older gentleman held her gaze for a moment longer than social convention dictated, a silent acknowledgement passing between them that created a momentary bridge across the vast chasm of power and privilege that separated their positions in this carefully constructed hierarchy. As she described the Chilean sea base, Amara calculated exactly how many more minutes she needed to endure at this table to ensure her grandmother would have medication next month, how many more mockeries equaled a roof over her head, how many degradations balanced against the dream of translation work that utilized all 7 languages she had mastered through years of disciplined study. The cork surrendered from the bottle of Chateau Margaux with a gentle sigh as Amara presented the label to Maxwell, who barely glanced at the premier crew before waving impatiently for her to pour. His fingers drummed against the starched tablecloth as she served each guest according to proper protocol, leaving him deliberately for last, as etiquette required for the host. When she finally approached his glass, Maxwell tilted his head with calculated casualness, his eyes gleaming with the particular satisfaction of a predator who has cornered something vulnerable. "Tell me about the terroir of this particular vineyard and how it affects the tannin structure," he demanded, his voice pitched to carry to nearby tables, clearly expecting her comprehension to falter at the specialized vocabulary. Amara paused, the bottle perfectly angled above his crystal glass, and responded in flawless French, her accent immediately transforming to match the precise Bordeaux regional inflection. The 1997 vintage benefits from the gravelly soils of the left bank, creating a firm tannic backbone that supports the cassis and violet notes without overwhelming the palate, she explained, continuing with a detailed analysis of the microclimate of Margaux and its effect on the Cabernet Sauvignon grapes that dominated the blend. The surprised silence lasted precisely 3 seconds before Maxwell recovered, his expression hardening as he interrupted her. "Anyone can memorize a few wine descriptions," he scoffed, his audience of executives nodding in practiced agreement while the older gentleman watched with increasing interest. His eyes narrowed with fresh challenge as he switched tactics. "Nai hui shuo zongwen ma?" Maxwell asked in poorly accented Mandarin, the question clearly intended as a dismissive joke rather than genuine inquiry. The familiarity of her native language flowed through Amara as naturally as breathing as she responded in perfect Mandarin, explaining that she not only spoke Chinese but had specialized in comparative linguistics between Cantonese and Mandarin during her studies, adding that his tonal pronunciation could use refinement particularly on the third falling rising tone. The executive to Maxwell's right choked slightly on his water, coughing into his napkin as Maxwell flushed. The rich crimson of the wine now mirrored in his complexion. The older gentleman set down his fork with deliberate care, the smallest smile playing at the corners of his mouth, as he observed the interaction with increasingly focused attention. The winemaker notes that this vintage pairs particularly well with humility, a quality unfortunately in short supply at this table, Amara concluded in English, filling Maxwell's glass precisely to the proper level, despite his evident discomfort. Another executive attempted to salvage the situation by complimenting the wine in halting Spanish, clearly attempting to find a linguistic territory where this unexpected server might falter. Amara responded in perfect Castilian Spanish, correcting his grammar with gentle precision before switching to Catalan to explain a subtle distinction about regional wine terminology. The table fell into confused silence, broken only by the older gentleman clearing his throat softly. His eyes now fixed on Amara with unmistakable appreciation and curiosity. Maxwell straightened his custom cufflinks, visibly regrouping for another attempt to regain control of the interaction that had so unexpectedly shifted beneath him. The confidence that had carried him through hostile takeovers and congressional testimonies now faced an entirely different challenge in the form of a server whose depths he had catastrophically underestimated, his worldview visibly struggling to accommodate this revelation. The crystal stemware clinked with nervous energy as Maxwell set his glass down with more force than necessary, droplets of the expensive Bordeaux leaping onto the white tablecloth like small crimson accusations. "Where exactly did a waitress learn to speak these languages?" he demanded, the word waitress wielded like a weapon intended to remind everyone of her place in the social hierarchy. The surrounding tables grew conspicuously quieter, the normal restaurant ambiance fading as neighboring diners tuned their attention toward the unfolding drama, silverware stilling against fine china. As Amara stood tall beside the table of powerful men, "I hold a linguistics degree from Harvard, class of 2018. Summa cum laude," she replied, her voice carrying just enough to reach the nearby tables without seeming intentionally theatrical. "I specialized in comparative syntax and phonological theory, with particular focus on tonal language acquisition patterns." The transformation in Maxwell's face registered as a series of micro-expressions, disbelief battling with irritation before settling into defensive skepticism. "Then why are you serving tables instead of working somewhere appropriate for someone with those credentials?" he challenged, his tone suggesting her claim was fabricated, despite the evidence of her linguistic abilities demonstrated moments earlier. Amara felt the familiar weight of this question, one she had answered in countless job interviews where excitement turned to awkward rejection. "After 26 interviews at firms, including yours, Mr. Stone, I was consistently deemed not a cultural fit for corporate environments, despite my qualifications," she explained, the phrase cultural fit hanging in the air with all its loaded implications. Sometimes the feedback mentioned concerns about my communication style or whether clients would relate to me. Other times it was simply a form rejection letter. The restaurant had grown so quiet that the clink of a spoon against coffee cup 3 tables away sounded almost intrusive. The power dynamic visibly shifted as diners at neighboring tables exchanged knowing glances, several nodding in recognition of a familiar pattern. Maxwell tugged at his collar, as if it had suddenly tightened, acutely aware of the public nature of this interaction and how it was being perceived. The serving staff paused in their duties, watching from various vantage points throughout the restaurant, years of similar experiences reflected in their attentive stance. His companions looked increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, one executive becoming intensely interested in his napkin, while another checked his watch despite having nowhere else to be. The older gentleman observed the exchange with the careful attention of someone gathering important information, his eyes moving between Amara and Maxwell with analytical precision. "La Maison Dorée continues to benefit from my language skills when international guests visit, and the flexible hours allow me to complete my second master's degree while caring for my grandmother," Amara continued, refusing to adopt an apologetic tone for circumstances that were not of her making. The statement hung in the air, challenging not just Maxwell but the entire system that had placed her in this position despite her qualifications. She stood framed by the elegant restaurant setting, the contrast between her current role and her credentials creating a visual representation of systemic inequities that was impossible to ignore in this moment. Maxwell reached for his wineglass again, clearly searching for a way to reassert control over an interaction that had veered dramatically from his expected script. The tension stretched between them like an invisible cord, charged with the energy of countless similar confrontations played out in boardrooms, offices, and public spaces where power and perception collided with reality and qualification. The older gentleman leaned forward slightly, his interest now unmistakable as he prepared to enter the conversation that had captured the attention of the entire restaurant. The silk pocket square in Maxwell's suit jacket trembled slightly as he cleared his throat and launched into Russian, the harsh consonants falling awkwardly from his tongue as he attempted to reclaim control through linguistic territory he clearly expected to be solely his. "Vy govorite po-Ruski?" he asked with clumsy pronunciation, his smirk returning as if he had finally found the boundary of her capabilities. Without hesitation, Amara responded in flowing, native-level Russian, explaining that she had studied at the Pushkin Institute during her junior year abroad and had served as a cultural liaison for visiting Russian academics at Harvard. The smirk evaporated from Maxwell's face as quickly as water on hot stone as he switched to Arabic, his desperation becoming increasingly evident in the stiffness of his shoulders and the forced quality of his smile. Amara responded in perfect Levantine Arabic, even correcting his dialectal error before explaining that her thesis had focused on comparative phonological patterns across Semitic language families. By the time he attempted Portuguese in a final desperate bid, the other executives had begun exchanging uncomfortable glances, their allegiance visibly shifting as the spectacle of their leader's humiliation played out before an audience of fascinated diners and staff. One executive studied his wineglass with intense focus, while another repeatedly checked his silent phone, their discomfort with the shifting power dynamic evident in their rigid postures and averted eyes. The quiet gentleman who had been observing the exchange with growing interest suddenly spoke, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to being heard, without raising his volume. "Unatumaini kufikia andoto gani katika maisha yako ya baadaye?" he asked in perfect Swahili, the melodic question about her future aspirations cutting through the tension like sunlight through storm clouds. Amara's face transformed, surprise giving way to genuine emotion as she responded in equally flawless Swahili, explaining her dream of working at the United Nations as a simultaneous interpreter, helping to bridge cultural divides through language. Her voice carried a passion previously hidden behind her professional demeanor, revealing the depth of her commitment to using her gifts for meaningful connection across borders and boundaries. The language flowed between them like a private river in the public space, creating an island of authentic communication amid the artificial constructs of the restaurant hierarchy. She spoke of her grandmother, who had encouraged her love of languages from childhood, of the scholarship that had opened doors to Harvard despite financial barriers, of her belief that understanding begins with truly hearing one another across linguistic divides. The gentleman nodded with evident appreciation, responding with words of encouragement that acknowledged both her struggles and her potential, their exchange transcending the restaurant setting to touch on universal human experiences of perseverance and purpose. Throughout their conversation, Maxwell shifted in his seat with increasing discomfort, witnessing a connection based on mutual respect and shared humanity that stood in stark contrast to his earlier mockery. The other diners watched in rapt attention, many smiling in appreciation of the unexpected turn of events, some even nodding in silent support of Amara's eloquence and dignity. The power balance had shifted entirely, not through confrontation, but through the simple revelation of authentic capability and passion that transcended the artificial boundaries of class and status, leaving Maxwell and his colleagues as awkward spectators to a genuine human connection that exposed the hollowness of their previous behavior. The fine crystal stemware caught the light as Dr. Okafor lifted his water glass, taking a measured sip before setting it down with the precise movement of a man accustomed to choosing his words with diplomatic care. "Mr. Stone, you may be wondering why I requested to join this particular dinner tonight, rather than meeting at your offices tomorrow as originally planned," he said, his tone conversational yet carrying an undercurrent of steel that commanded complete attention from everyone within earshot. The truth is that the United Nations takes extraordinary care in selecting partners for our global technology initiative, a contract which I understand your company values at approximately $4 billion. Maxwell swallowed visibly, his Adam's apple bobbing beneath his expensive collar as the true stakes of the evening suddenly crystallized in the space between them. My experience has taught me that how people treat those they perceive as having no power over them reveals far more about their character than any corporate presentation or charity gala ever could, Dr. Okafor continued, his gaze steady and unflinching. The executive to Maxwell's right shifted his chair almost imperceptibly, the slight movement creating a physical distance that telegraphed his psychological separation more clearly than words ever could. I regret to inform you that the United Nations cannot in good conscience partner with leadership that demonstrates such fundamental disrespect for human dignity, regardless of technical capabilities or market position, Dr. Okafor stated, each word falling like a gavel sealing judgment. The contract will be awarded to your competitor, whose CEO spent yesterday morning personally thanking their janitorial staff for working through the weekend. The impact of his words registered on Maxwell's face with devastating clarity, color draining from his features as he calculated the catastrophic financial and reputational damage in real time. $4 billion evaporating into the evening air, stock prices plummeting with the morning news, board members calling emergency meetings by sunrise. The executive who had earlier laughed loudest at Maxwell's mockery now consulted his watch with sudden urgency, mumbling about another commitment before standing abruptly. I should actually be going as well, the woman across from him added, gathering her belongings with the haste of someone evacuating a burning building. Within 30 seconds, 3 of the 5 executives had created obvious separation between themselves and Maxwell, leaving empty chairs that seemed to physically represent the collapse of his business prospects. Throughout the restaurant, phones appeared in hands as diners recognized the significance of what they were witnessing, the news already propagating through digital networks even before the official announcement. Dr. Okafor turned back to Amara, his expression warming as he addressed her again, the contrast in his demeanor highlighting the judgment he had just delivered. The behavior I witnessed tonight only confirms what our research already suggested about company culture at Orion Technologies, he said, nodding slightly toward Maxwell without directly looking at him, the diplomatic equivalent of a devastating dismissal. The 4th executive now stood awkwardly, muttering apologies as he too abandoned ship, leaving only the original party of 6 reduced to 3 figures around a table designed for 8. The geometric arrangement itself told the story of downfall, empty chairs marking the exodus of support and alliance. Maxwell attempted to speak, but found himself utterly without leverage or audience, his usual arsenal of financial threats and promises rendered meaningless before the moral authority now controlling the interaction. The restaurant had become a theater of consequences, every table watching the real-time collapse of a business empire built on technical brilliance but moral bankruptcy. Nearby, Marcel stood with perfect posture, his earlier doubts about Amara's suitability for this table transformed into something approaching awe as he witnessed power redistributed according to character rather than wealth. The ambient light softened as evening deepened, casting a golden glow across the restaurant as Dr. Okafor gently suggested that he and Amara might speak privately for a moment near the small alcove by the restaurant's collection of rare wines. Maxwell remained at the table alone, his empire of influence reduced to an island of isolation as he mechanically signed the check with fingers that seemed to have aged years in minutes. "Here is my private card, Doctor," Okafor said once they stood apart from listening ears, extending a simple cream rectangle bearing the United Nations emblem and a direct number rarely shared outside diplomatic circles. "I would like to formally invite you to interview for our simultaneous translation department next Tuesday at 10 in the morning, a position that would utilize your extraordinary linguistic gifts and offer the diplomatic career path you have been seeking." Amara accepted the card with steady hands that betrayed nothing of the earthquake of emotion beneath her professional exterior. Years of rejected applications and closed doors suddenly replaced by an open path forward. "Your talent has been hidden in plain sight, much like the most valuable things often are," Dr. Okafor continued, his voice carrying the wisdom of someone who had witnessed similar patterns across continents and cultures. "We desperately need people with both your technical skills and your grace under pressure for the peacekeeping negotiations in Eastern Europe next month." Across the restaurant, a subtle transformation had begun, as surely as weather changing, the atmosphere shifting perceptibly as other diners and staff processed what they had witnessed. The sommelier who had earlier addressed only the male guests now approached Amara with newfound respect, offering his congratulations with a deferential nod that acknowledged her revealed status. Servers who had passed her daily with minimal acknowledgement now found reasons to approach, their body language communicating a re-evaluation of someone they had categorized solely by uniform rather than capability. A woman dining with her teenage daughter stopped by on her way to the exit, touching Amara's arm gently to thank her for the example she had set, explaining that her daughter was struggling with similar barriers in her advanced science classes. The maitre d', who had assigned sections with rigid adherence to unofficial hierarchy, now hovered nearby, his expressions cycling through calculations of how this new information might require adjustment to his mental organizational chart. Marcel approached with uncharacteristic humility, his typical authoritative stance replaced by something approaching contrition as he offered to cover her tables for the remainder of the evening so she could properly discuss opportunity with the Secretary General. Throughout the dining room, perception visibly realigned with reality, as the woman they had seen only as a server was revealed as a scholar, linguist, and soon-to-be diplomat whose capabilities had been present but unrecognized all along. The older couple at table 14 raised their glasses in a silent toast when she glanced their way, while the businessman who had earlier snapped his fingers for service now watched her with the uncomfortable recognition of his own assumptions laid bare. Dr. Okafor observed these shifting dynamics with knowing eyes that had witnessed similar transformations across countless cultural contexts. "The world often confuses packaging for content," he noted quietly, his metaphor encompassing both Amara and the broader social patterns her experience represented. But authentic excellence has a way of eventually breaking through even the most entrenched perceptions. Amara stood straighter as the weight of countless microaggressions and dismissals began lifting from her shoulders, replaced by the validation of being truly seen beyond role and circumstance. The restaurant had become a microcosm of society itself, demonstrating how quickly established hierarchies could dissolve when confronted with undeniable merit that challenged comfortable assumptions about who belonged where. In the carefully constructed social order that suddenly seemed far more arbitrary than it had just 1 hour earlier, the private staff corridor outside the kitchen provided just enough solitude for Amara to press trembling fingers against her phone screen, her grandmother's familiar voice answering on the third ring despite the late hour. "Nana," Amara whispered, the single word carrying oceans of emotion as tears blurred the service schedule pinned to the wall before her. "I just met the Secretary General of the United Nations, and he offered me an interview for the translation department." The disbelieving gasp from the other end of the line mirrored her own continuing shock as her grandmother began to pray loudly in their native Creole, blessings and gratitude flowing freely between exclamations of vindication. "Remember how you always told me that education was the one thing no one could take from me," Amara continued, the memory of countless nights studying by flashlight when electricity bills went unpaid, rising between them like a shared triumph. The story spilled from her in a rush of details, from Maxwell's cruel mockery to the breathtaking reversal orchestrated by cosmic justice wearing an elegant suit and diplomatic credentials. Meanwhile, across the restaurant, Maxwell Stone exited through the front door alone, the usual coterie of assistants and admirers conspicuously absent as news of his catastrophic business loss spread through financial networks with the ruthless efficiency his own algorithms had pioneered. His shoulders hunched slightly beneath his $5,000 jacket, reputation damaged beyond the repair capabilities of even his most skilled public relations team, as eyewitness accounts of his behavior circulated through social media with accompanying hashtags. Back inside, Amara slipped her grandmother's hand-knit Lucky Charm from her pocket and pressed it briefly to her lips before returning to the dining room with squared shoulders and the first genuine smile of her entire shift. Her remaining tables had transformed in her brief absence. The dynamics shifted like tectonic plates, revealing new landscapes of possibility. The young couple at table 7 addressed her in hesitant Spanish when she approached with their dessert, their awkward but sincere attempt at connection replacing their earlier indifference. The business executive who had ignored her all evening now spoke in formal Japanese, explaining that he had worked in Tokyo for 3 years and wondered if she might recommend a language learning application for his daughter who showed linguistic aptitude. Each interaction carried the weight of recalibrated perception, small adjustments in behavior that collectively represented seismic shifts in how she was seen and valued within the same physical space she had occupied all evening. Marcel hovered nearby with uncharacteristic deference, his earlier judgment replaced by the particular discomfort of someone confronting the limitations of their own perception. Dr. Okafor had left his official card, propped against a crystal water glass, the United Nations emblem catching the light, while his personal note on the back confirmed Tuesday, 10 a.m., 9th floor translation department, with the words, "Your grandmother must be incredibly proud," penned in elegant script that acknowledged the personal story behind her professional journey. As Amara moved through her final service duties with renewed confidence, the awareness of Tuesday morning waiting just 5 days away infused each step with purpose. The restaurant continued its elegant rhythms around her, but she now moved through it as a person in transition rather than in place, each moment carrying her closer to the career path that had seemed impossibly distant just hours earlier. When she passed the table where Maxwell had sat, now empty except for the generous tip left by Dr. Okafor, she allowed herself one small moment of private victory, not over a person but over a system that had nearly succeeded in convincing her that her place was determined by others' perceptions rather than her own capabilities and character.